kind of review talk. I just want to basically cover the libraries that are available on Hackage for GUI programming, and also just how viable GUI programming is in Haskell. So fundamentally, I'm going to be looking at this question, which is, can you do GUI programming in Haskell? And in my opinion, the answer is most definitely yes. And we've known this for a while, but that said, people have been quite nervous about doing graphical user interfaces in Haskell. And I think that the landscape has changed a little bit in 2015. So just to review with the libraries that are available to start with, we've still got the kind of bindings for doing native applications. So we've got bindings for both GTK2 and GTK3, which are standard UI toolkits on Linux, which are usually used for the GNOME desktop environment. These bindings are extremely exhaustive, covering almost the entire GTK API. This year we've also got some support for Qt now. We don't have extensive support for the whole Qt API. It's a C++ API, which is quite difficult to write bindings for in Haskell. But with the HSQML project, you can write Qt applications using this, it's kind of like a JavaScript syntax called QML, which lets you declare what your user interface looks like, and then you can load this into Haskell applications and wire up the kind of buttons and the user interface and do your logic programming in Haskell. So that's a nice middle ground. We've still got support for WX widgets, which is another cross-platform UI toolkit. That's provided in the WX package. And again, this is a fairly extensive set of bindings, which allows you to assemble user interfaces in Haskell and, of course, wire in all the logic as well. And we've got one new toolkit this year, which is another set of bindings to FLTK, which is, again, a cross-platform user interface toolkit, although it looks kind of non-native on any platform. So it has its own styling. So if you need something that looks consistent, then I'd consider looking at maybe GTK, Qt, or WX. But FLTK is meant to be very lightweight and somewhat easier to distribute. But that said, all of these do have some distribution problems, which I'm going to touch on later. So if ease of distribution is the choice, then another option is to use FreePenny GUI. So the idea behind FreePenny GUI is you write all of your user interface in Haskell, and you declare how the user interface should be assembled and laid out. But when you actually run the application, it launches a HTTP server, and you use the web browser as your UI presentation layer. So you don't have to worry about any native libraries, because as long as the user has a web browser, then they're going to be able to use the user interface. And of course, we also have the ability to work completely in the browser these days, but still writing Haskell code with projects such as GHC.js. So in GHC.js, you can work with the DOM directly and build up a HTML tree of your user interface, but you never have to write a line of JavaScript. So there's quite a few libraries that are available now. So I just wanted to kind of outline some of the considerations of why you might choose one or the other. And in my opinion, if you're building any type of complex user interface, one of the most important things is the ability to design that visually rather than having to do it in code. So for GTK, you can use the Glade application, and you can also use GNOME Builder, and that's a screenshot of it there. And that just lets you lay out the user interface kind of graphically. Unfortunately, you don't get to use all of the features, because down here there's some support for kind of connecting signals to functions, which doesn't translate too well into Haskell, so you have to wire that in manually. And for Qt, there's the Qt Creator, which lets you generate these QML diagrams, QML files, which you can then load into a Haskell application later. But for the other UI toolkits that I mentioned, there is no way that I know about to compose them visually, so you'd have to lay the entire user interface out by code, which for complex applications I think is really kind of a non-starter. Another consideration is the problem of distribution, and this has historically been one of the biggest pain points of doing user interface programming in Haskell. The native UI toolkits do suffer from increased complexity in distribution because the user running the application has to have certain C libraries installed, such as GTK or Qt. And that's usually somewhat easy to do on Linux, but if you're trying to be completely cross-platform and target OS X and Windows, then that can be a real source of pain. So if ease of distribution is key, then you might want to look at something like FreePenny GUI, where you can basically just rely on the user having a web browser, which almost all operating systems are going to have. The other consideration is what you're actually trying to do with the user interface in terms of its complexity. Obviously, most of these UI toolkits are fine if you're just kind of laying out buttons and labels and things like that, but some applications you might have a need for doing some very kind of bespoke user interface components. So GTK Free and FLTK at least have support for OpenGL. I think some of the others might do as well. And I've had success in the past drawing custom controls using the diagrams library. which lets me write some very idiomatic Haskell. And then I can render that using Cairo directly to GTK components. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment. And for an extremely bespoke application such as Blender and the kind of other 3D modeling software, you might just want to do the whole user interface yourself, in which case we now have a bunch of different ways you can do that. We've got bindings to SDL, which is a kind of a basic library to open windows and do basic drawing, or we've got the OpenGL library and Cairo and a couple of other libraries there. And these are all cross-platform again, so you're not tying yourself to just Linux or just OS X. Finally, you obviously want to kind of assemble these applications to do something useful, and you've got a couple of options available on Hackage to wire in that application logic. So, of course, you could just use the naive callbacks that are provided by the UI library that you're using. That's usually a callback-based approach, and in my opinion, doesn't scale particularly well with complexity. It's got all of the problems that you have with doing stuff with callbacks. But you can abstract this in Haskell, so two options I've outlined here is one using the kind of traditional model view controller architecture. Gabriel Gonzalez has a library called MVC there, which kind of brings this MVC paradigm into Haskell. And my personal preference is to use functional reactive programming techniques. And we've got a couple of libraries on Hackage available for doing that, such as Reactive Banana, Reflex, FRP Now, and there's a couple more as well. So I didn't really want to get into what functional reactive programming is, but more to present the options that you've got available so you don't have to use FRP, and you don't have to use naive callbacks either. So my experiences of doing UI programming, when I grew up as a kid, I used to play Doom a lot, and one of my favorite things there was to build my own levels for Doom. So this year I wanted to revisit that and just see if I could build my own kind of Doom game engine and sketch out levels in some sort of user interface. So this is a screenshot of the kind of latest incarnation of the level editor. The idea is you kind of draw the corners of your rooms and you connect those with walls, and then you can render this out as a playable kind of OpenGL game. So just to give you an idea of that, this is the first kind of iteration of this. Now I'm just sketching out a level, drawing the corners of my room, and the green line there is representing the kind of room that's in progress. And then I can hit play, and it runs that out in an OpenGL application, and I can move around the scene. And then that grew a little bit more in complexity to that screenshot I showed you before, which is the same kind of idea, but I've just refined that user interface. So to do the drawing here of the main control, that's using the diagrams project, and I render that with the Cairo backend directly down to a GTK drawing area control, and it interacts nicely with the scroll bars and all the rest of the kind of user interface. So just in conclusion now, I think Haskell is a good choice for UI programming. I think hopefully there I've proven that you can do kind of non-trivial user interfaces with bespoke controls if you need to. And we've got many different options available for doing this now, whether you want to have a native application that runs on the desktop or you're willing to work inside a web browser. And it's still possible to write idiomatic Haskell. And my kind of example there is that that custom rendering I did used the diagrams project. I didn't have to drop down to kind of almost writing C-like code with the very stateful OpenGL API. I was able to use a nice Haskell library straight off the shelf. We've got some support for the visual composition of user interfaces, but it's definitely not first-class support as you would have in like Objective-C and things like that. And it doesn't cover all of the UI toolkits. And this last point is, I think mobile devices are really a kind of up-and-coming place that you need user interfaces, and Haskell has very poor support for that at the moment. It is looking interesting because you can now target GHC on Android and iOS, I believe, but we have no bindings to the actual UI toolkits there, so I don't think there's much you can really do practically to build applications to release onto the App Store yet. So for me, I'd be really interested to see how that changes as we go on. So that's everything I wanted to cover. Hopefully I've kind of motivated people that you can do this stuff, and if you've got more questions on this, feel free to ask me now or grab me later. Yeah, all of the actual interaction of this drawing area is Reactive Banana. And in fact, the whole UI is Reactive Banana as well. So, yeah, all the way.